class on Mishnah Berurah. Today's class is going to be focusing on quite a few different Simanim, mostly because they are very short. So we're going to go through a few of them today, and it's also a very, very cold, unseasonably cold morning here. So if I look a little frigid, it's with extra base layers on, it's because it is a little cold this morning. So that's your live update from Washington, D.C. weather for today. But today we will now start with someone who wants to say two prayers. So you're beginning with Siman Kufay, chapter 105. And we're going to talk about someone who wishes to pray two straight tefillos, two straight prayers. We'll answer the question about why would you want to do that in a moment. Okay, so someone who wants to pray two prayers, one after the other, they have to wait between the two prayers the length of time to walk 4 amos. Okay, so that's enough time to go ahead and walk about 6 feet. In order for their thought processes to be calmed and they could begin to pray in a satisfactorily a language of request. They would be making a requesting fashion. So as opposed to sort of just blowing through it, you want to make sure that you're set to make a request. Okay, so we've seen this before. Now the question is, what are these two prayers? So the Berurah jumps right in. He says, you have Shachris and Musaf. All right, what do? You daven Shachris, and let's say you finish Shachris, and there's no one to read the Torah, and you want to go right into Musaf. Okay, he doesn't say that. I'm just explaining how that would happen. Or you forgot to say one of the prayers, and you have to make it up in the immediately following prayer service. You forgot Shachris. You need to say Mincha twice. You need to say twice there. Now, we learned earlier in Siman Kuf Ches, okay, which is we're going to learn later in Siman Kuf Ches, in the Berurah, that whether you forgot the evening prayer and are saying the morning twice, okay, in order to make up for it, or whether you forgot Shachris and now you're saying Mincha twice to make it up, you have to say Ashrei between the two of them, okay? And this is only a case of where you forgot to say that prayer service, okay? So that's not the case when you forgot Mincha and you have to make it up in the evening, because in that case you don't say Ashrei, and we're going to explain why there. Okay, and that's when this rule will be most applicable. So you have to wait the Hiluch Arba Amos, and the length of this time needs to be the time from which you would take, you're lifting your foot up and say the words Oseh Shalom, right? So, about maybe 5-10 seconds. So give yourself, if I said give yourself 10 seconds, that would be an easier way to describe that. Okay, so that's what we say in order to do that. And Berurah further explains that in the work known as Shulchan Shlomo, if you finish your Shmona Esrei and you haven't picked up your feet yet to step backwards, and you realize you made a mistake in your prayers, you need to go back and repeat them. You should still wait as well. So you know that you got to the end, you're like, oh, I forgot Yalav Yavo. That's the most common mistake. Okay? And now why do you have to wait this walking amount? Well, that's even if you don't want to go back to your original place. You're going to go pray in a new place where you're going to step to. You're going to move to a different place. Okay? However, if you go back to the place from which you started, then even if you don't want to say the next prayer there, you have to still follow the rules for waiting as if you were finishing up a Shemona Esrei, which we're going to learn about in Siman Kuf Chaf Gimel. Okay, so we'll get back to that. So basically, just take a slight pause. You'll say Asher between everything except between Mincha. If you forget Mincha, I have to repeat it at Mariv. All right, Kuf Vav 106. Who need not recite the Shemona Esrei prayers? So, all those, the Shulchan Aruch explains, all those exempt from the Shema, the recitation of the Shema, Kriya Shema, are exempt from prayer as well. And all those obligated in the Shema are also obligated in the prayers as well. Okay? Except for people who accompany the dead body, okay? And they are accompanying it without having to actually carry it, which is known as the Berurah is not in need of them to carry it. Okay? Someone else is carrying it and they're just accompanying it. Okay? Even though they must recite the Shema, they need not recite Shemona Esrei. So what does this mean? Why are they exempt from the Shema? We learned this earlier in Siman Samach Gimel. The Mishnah explains that you're osek b'mitzvah and therefore patur min a mitzvah. You are engaged in a mitzvah and therefore exempt from this. Okay, or it's because you're busy doing a mitzvah and you shouldn't have to figure out how to do another one. So what does this mean that there's a need for them? So the Mishnah explains that they are not ready to help with carrying the beer itself. Because if that were not the case, they would be exempt from the Shema as well. And we learned about this in Siman Ayin Beis at the very beginning. Okay, Siman 72. Okay, but they're exempt from prayer, we say at the end, even though they have to recite the Shema. Why is that? Because this is only a rabbinic requirement, and the main thing is that they have to be standing still in order to recite the prayers. And they can't really do that when they're accompanying the mace, accompanying the person to the grave. But Kriya Shema, it's only one line long. You can stop for that moment, say that, and you can quickly catch up with the rest of everybody else. Okay. Now, if accompanying this thing would cause you to pass and lose the time for reciting Shemona Esrei, you do not need to repeat your Shemona Esrei later in the day, because at the time of when you needed to do it, you were exempt. And we learned this in Siman Sadi Gimel, okay, 93, and look in the Mishnah Berurah there. However, there is an exception to our first rule. Women and servants, even though they are exempt from the Shema, they are nonetheless obligated to recite the Shemona Esrei, because it's a mitzvah aseh, which is not time-bound. But children that have reached the age of chinuch, that must receive mitzvah education, you must teach them to say Shemona Esrei. Okay, so what does this mean? It's a mitzvah aseh. So the Mishnah Berurah explains the following. This is according to the Rambam, who says that the times for prayer are the rabbinic requirements, but there is an essential requirement for prayer that is required by the Torah. Okay? Why? Because we are told, Avdo b'chol levavchem. So what is service of the heart? This is prayer. However, we don't have a set amount from the Torah of what needs to be said, and therefore a person can say whatever it is they want to say at any time they want to say it. Okay? And as long as they have made an effort to pray once a day or once at night, that's their obligation from the Torah. The Magen Avraham explains here that based on this assertion of the Rambam, many women do not recite the Shemona Esrei on a regular basis, especially morning Shemona Esrei, or even in the evening, because they say upon first rising in the morning, after they've washed their hands, they recite this very short prayer service. Okay? And based on the Torah requirements, they fulfill the obligation with this. And so therefore it seems that the rabbis also were talking about this as well. But the Ramban, who disagrees with the Rambam, says that it's completely a rabbinic requirement, and it was enacted by the Anshe Knesset HaGadol, the men of the Great Assembly, the men who led Israel in the early days of the Persian Empire. Okay, and that went all the way until the early days of the Alexander's Empire, the Greeks, Macedonians. Okay, so that was where the requirement came up. And that's why women have to recite the entire prayer service as it's written in our Sidurs nowadays. And the obligation is for the Shacharis one and the Mincha one, so in the morning and in the afternoon. And there's no obligation for the evening one. And even though it's a rabbinic requirement, and it's time bound, normally women are exempt from those type of mitzvah says, even when it's rabbinic, right? Like Kiddush, Lavana, even though, so nonetheless, they were still required to recite these prayers morning and afternoon, just like men. Because by prayer, it is a request for mercy. And that seems to be the essential opinion, says the Mishnah Berurah, because most poskim agree with this and say, based on what is said in the work Sha'agas Aryeh, 19th century work on halakha, and so that's why you should tell the women that they need to say Shemona Esrei, okay, twice a day, morning and afternoon. And it's also appropriate to say that they should accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven, right? The Ol Malchus Shemayim, and they should say at least the pasuk of Shema Yisrael. And we said that earlier in Siman Ayin, and that they should do as well. And they should also say the blessing of Emes V'Yatziv in order to make the Smuchla Tefillah. Okay, so that you want to make it like that. You want to make the prayers abutting each other. And the Magen Avraham further says in Siman Ayin, which we saw earlier, which is something that the Magen Avraham said in Siman Ayin. And this is also when it comes to Shachris and Mincha. But for the evening prayer service in Arvit, which is only a permissive thing, it's nice to say it, even though most men act like it's an obligation, nonetheless, it essentially is only a permission. It's just something that we like to do. And they did accept that upon themselves. And Musaf, according to one opinion, is that they are exempt, but according to the other one, they have to say it. Let's see. Is it correct to... Why does it show it and then take it down as I start reading it? All right. Is it correct to discern that the Torah speaks in spiritual levels of heart and attitude and higher things? The rabbis clarify... Every time I tap it, it falls away. The rabbis clarify performance action within this world. We need both. So yeah, there is a requirement to basically focus your energy on completing these things and doing them appropriately. So that I would agree with that assessment. Okay, and so therefore you need to have both of those things even when reciting the prayer service. This would be required. So even though technically not sure of what the requirement is and how much intention you need, nonetheless the minhag developed to do that, to recite the prayer service for women. Okay. Gimel. Okay. One who is a full-time learning person, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his students, they must stop to recite the Shema, but need not stop to recite the Shemona Esrei. But those like us, they should stop for Shemona Esrei, whether it's Kriya Shema or Shemona Esrei. The Rabbah adds, and if they teach others, they don't stop. Okay, which we learned earlier in Siman Pei Tes, 89. And nonetheless, they go ahead and stop to recite the first line of the Shema. And if the time is not urgent and you're not going to miss the time for reciting it, and you have enough time to say the Shemona Esrei and to say the Shema, you don't have to stop teaching or learning in those cases. So let's look at the Mishnah Berurah about this. So the Mishnah Berurah tries to explain what it was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. They had no other job in the world other than this. They never stopped their learning at all, even for a moment. But those of us who stop to do our work, we certainly have to stop for Shema and have to stop for a prayer service. I'm yawning so much. Okay, you have to stop for the Shema as well. Okay, so we say that's the appropriate thing to do. Why? Because the Torah requires us to do this mitzvah, whereas Tefillah is only rabbinic. And even though you want to say that there's, it's a Torah mitzvah, nonetheless, according to Torah, it doesn't have a set time, and one time during the day suffices. And that's what we just said in the previous halacha. And therefore, when you recite the Shema, and you recite it with some of its blessings, and then go back to your learning, you wouldn't need to pray. Okay? Because, again, you've said some prayers with those. And after that, you go back to learning, and you don't need to stop to pray there as well. Okay? Even though you have to stop your learning to do other mitzvahs, even rabbinic ones, because someone who is learning and doesn't fulfill any mitzvahs, it's better they were never created. Nonetheless, for prayer, it's nothing more than a request for mercy. It's considered more lenient than other types of mitzvahs, especially for men. It's as if they haven't. It's as if they shouldn't stop learning even for a moment. Okay, but I don't have to, like they said, like they're learning all the time. And so the Ramah adds, you do not stop. Okay. And he says it's even if by stopping you're going to miss out on the time to say them. And it's only in a way if you were not currently in the midst of teaching, you would stop. And you couldn't get everybody back together again to continue learning, okay? Because if you could, you should stop. Especially if it's going to miss the time of Kriya Shema, okay? Or Shemona Esrei. From the Sefer Chai Adam, it sounds like in every case you have to stop if you're going to miss the time for prayer. And someone who doesn't pray because of his learning, even if he's learning with others, the entire single day is as if he never learned. And in another work known as Eliyah Rabbah, it says further that the Piskei Tosfos held that the same thing. Okay, that there was this is the same approach to them. And then in the Biur Halacha, the Mishnah Berurah says that everybody agrees that a person should not start learning until they've gone ahead and done all their davening, and even if it's learning with others. They still have to daven first, okay? If you know for a fact that you could start learning and not miss out on the time of Tefillah, that would be okay. But you would have to recite the Shema ahead of time if you think you might miss it. So we said, why is it that you can start without having to stop for the Shema? Because all I have to say is one line, the first line. Why? Because that first line talks about accepting the yoke of heaven upon yourself, and therefore you can go back to what you were learning. Okay? You also should say Yetzias Mitzrayim in order to make that as well. Talking about the exodus from Egypt, so should also be mentioned. And when you finish learning and that you've already passed the time for the Shema, you can go back and recite all of it. Okay? But we said that you really shouldn't stop when you are teaching others. Okay? So that's teaching us the following. Even to stop for one line of the Shema, and even to stop and learn by yourself. All right? Now, the later authorities write the following. Even if you started learning where it was after you should have davened, all right? So light broke and you should start davening, but you started learning instead. Okay? You can't go ahead and start learning again until you pray. That's what you should do. Okay? Especially if you're learning at home. You don't actually go to the main synagogue to do the learning. Okay? And we saw that earlier in Siman Peites about someone who has their own private Beit Midrash. You can stay there and do all your prayer and everything there, and you're exempt from a minyan. Nonetheless, if you started, you don't have to stop, and you can keep learning, as long as there's still time, to go ahead and say it later. According to the work Eliyahu Rabbah, that by Kriya Shema, even if you have long time to go ahead and put it off, you shouldn't. Okay, you should stop to recite it. And if you are learning by yourself, we talked about this a little bit in Siman Ayin 70, okay, and we also talked about it here too. And the whole point is you can't be learning at home, okay. But if you're learning in the school, in the Beit Midrash, okay, or you're doing it at home, but you started learning while it was permitted to learn, like it was at night, and the time of Kriya Shema hadn't even started yet, okay, which would be after sunbreak, then that would be fine. You could then continue doing it until you have a time to take a break. But you should take a break in these cases because you're being ordered to, even though you're going to, as long as you afterwards have time to kind of hold it off. Okay. Kuf Zion. Okay, now the question is whether or not you prayed. Okay? And you want to make a free prayer, right? A Tefillah Nadava, one that you're not obligated to make. Okay, if you are not sure, halacha aleph, we're in 107. If you're not sure if you prayed, then you need to pray again. You don't have to say anything new in it. You just pray again. But if you're pretty clear that you prayed, you don't pray again. And if you want to pray without adding something new in it, you would have to make it a nadava at the outset. And that one's something you can do at any time of the day, as many times as you'd like, as long as you add something to it that's novel. Okay? But you can't do that with Musaf prayer, because Musaf prayer addresses specifically the korban itself. Okay? And on Shabbos and Yom Tov, we don't say a free prayer, a Tefillah Sadava. And if you went ahead and started praying with the intent to not pray for a Nadava, and then you realize you already started praying, okay, even if you're in the middle of a blessing, you can stop right there. Okay? There's a question. Let's get to the question real quick. Okay. Seems that prayer or praise is our gift to Hashem. Torah is his gift to us. We should give him his gift first before we take for ourselves. No, it's really more basic than that. It's really because you're engaged in one mitzvah and exempt from another one. It's just a simple operation of law. Yeah, so that's why we do that. So it's just a more specific law that has more gravity to it. Same thing too. If you were engaged in a long prayer service, you would be exempt from prayer. That's another problem we'll get to at another time. But if you started praying, you can continue to pray and not feel like you have to shorten it in order to go learn. Okay, so if you're going to say, if you were not sure if you said it, you should say it again. The Mishnah explains that if you look earlier in Siman Samach Zion 67, that we have those rules over there about if you weren't sure if you said it or not. Okay, we said there was a question of whether or not you were on the Torah level obligation or the rabbinic obligation. So it depends on which blessing you're saying and what you said so far. So we say you go pray again, and you should make a condition in the following way. If I didn't pray, let this be for my obligation. If I did pray, let this be for a free will offering of a prayer service. And even though the doubt is a rabbinic doubt, and you could be lenient, nonetheless, this case, you go ahead and have to pray again. Okay? Because a person should feel like they should be able to pray all day long. And it's not a bad thing. Okay? And you have to make sure you add something new into it, which we're going to explain more in detail in a moment. And in this case is when you go ahead and repeat it because you're not sure if you said it last time. So that's why you have to go ahead and repeat it again, but you should, you have no greater novelty to this thing than the fact is like, I am saying this because I don't think I prayed yet today. So in another work called the Derech HaChaim, if you don't know if you prayed the evening service in Arvit, you don't have to repeat Arvit again, which we said over here, because it's, even though we've made it like an obligation, it's really not, okay? However, the Pri Megadim disagrees that even though you don't have a full-fledged obligation, like all the other ones, it's really you really should go ahead and say it again if you're not sure, because you have accepted it upon yourselves. So it's still nice to do that, even though you're saying that it's not obligatory. And you should still, if you're not sure and you try to say it all the time, then you should try to go ahead and get it said. Okay, so we say that you don't have to go and repeat it again. And the reason why is when you aren't sure that you missed it. Okay, and you don't repeat if you don't need to say it, you don't repeat it, because of the fact that it's like the daily offering, and the only reason why you were offering is because there was an obligation, and you couldn't bring a second one because that would be prohibited, because like bringing a second obligation of which there isn't one. Okay, and now if a person wants to go ahead and catch the minion, so nonetheless we would say you're adding on something else. So therefore you shouldn't do it unless it's for an absolute, unless you absolutely know you forgot to say it, or you want to say it as a free offering. So we call it a nadava, okay? You can go ahead and say that when it is that. It's offered freely. But to say that I'm trying to make up for an obligation, even if you had in mind to do it for your obligation, even by adding something new to it, that's no good. You can't do that, because you need to say that it's for my it's a new one for my obligation. Okay, so that's why you wouldn't go ahead and just start it over again. Okay, so you have to have an intent to add on to it, or you have to have intent to use it for your obligation. Okay, and the reason why when you make it a free one and you add something novel to the text, that's why we're saying it's considered a civil additional supplication, but not the actual obligatory one. And without adding it, it feels like an obligation, and that's not what we want it to look like. And the Beis Yosef himself in his commentary, that according to the Torah, if you went ahead and prayed, not at the time when the Torah obligated you to pray, and you weren't intending to pray for a free will purpose, and you thought that you just needed to pray now, so then, it's then considered to be for your filling your obligation, because it was done in that fashion. So there's a difference between having the intent to do it for your obligation and having the intent to do it free will. And he goes into this more detail in Berurah, which we won't get to today. So we don't say this rule by Musaf, okay? Which is to say that no matter which Musaf it is, whether it's Rosh Chodesh or Chol Moed in the middle of the holidays, since you said the Musaf correctly, and they're only for the offering itself, the Musaf offering, okay, and the offerings were part of the community, and a single person isn't really obligated to bring it. And so therefore, that's why you don't have to go ahead and repeat that. And you don't have, if you start it again, you don't have to say it. You can have to finish it. And see later on, with other opinions, that based on their understanding of Musaf, and same thing too with Yom Tov and Shabbos prayers, and all of those prayers, if you don't know if you said them, you don't repeat them again. Okay? And let's see. And that's just simply what we were saying earlier in Sifkat and Bays. Okay? So unless you're making a condition to make it a free will. Okay? So that's an important distinction. Let's see. All right, so let's talk about the novel thing you have to add in there. Okay, so the novel thing you have to add in there, you have to add something in every single blessing of the middle blessings, not the first three and not the last three. It has to be pertinent to each one of those blessings. And if you invent something, even in one blessing, that suffices in order to demonstrate that it's done for the purposes of a free offering prayer, not an obligation. The Ramah adds, some say that it's not considered something novel unless it's considered something novel by you. Okay, and it's newbie, and you didn't need this thing beforehand. Okay, and the Berurah added this thing about the three beforehand and three afterwards. Okay, third halacha, that Tzibur does not ever recite a free will prayer. Why? Because they don't. Because it's like free will offerings. It's not that. Okay. And so therefore, we only bring the davas in order to not let the altar be idle. Okay, but it's not the same thing with Shemona Esrei. All right, so that's why we don't do that. So an individual person can do that, but not the whole congregation. Now, if you want to recite a Tefillah Sadava, all right, so here's what you need to do. You need to recognize in yourself that you're going to be very, very cautious and alert to what you're saying in your prayer. Again, that's assuming this is without a Siddur. And you're going to listen to everything that you say from the beginning until the end. But if you can't focus yourself, then, why do you, then really would say back, why you bring all these extra offerings, And really what you should do is to focus more on the ones that are obligated during the day, focus on those a little bit more. Okay? And even though you're following this pattern, you also have to make sure that you can also follow with the intentionality of it as well. So that is that. Okay? We'll talk more about the laws of being erroneous with prayer. Next week will very likely be at a different time if I can figure out what time that will be. But next week will be being Chol Moed Pesach. We'll come up with a new time. Stay tuned, and we will try to get this learned next week as well. Everyone should take care and Chag Kasher V'Sameach.